HOA Karen called cops. While I moved my daughter's things into our lake cabin, I banned her HOA. The gravel crunched under our tires as we pulled up to the lake cabin for the first time since Sarah's funeral 9 months ago. I could see Sophie's shoulders tense in the passenger seat, her hands fidgeting with the sleeves of her oversized hoodie. This place held so many memories of her mother, and I wasn't sure if bringing her here was healing or torture. "Dad, are you sure about this?" Sophie whispered, staring at the weathered cedar siding and wraparound porch that faced the lake. I turned off the engine and looked at my 16-year-old daughter, her face pale and withdrawn. We'd been living in survival mode for months, just getting through each day, and I was desperate to see even a glimpse of the bright, laughing girl she used to be. That's when she saw it. The swing set that Sarah had insisted we install 3 summers ago. It was a simple wooden swing hanging from the old oak tree. But Sarah had spent hours on that swing, reading books and watching the sunset. Sophie approached it cautiously, like she was approaching a sacred shrine. Then something magical happened. She sat down on the swing and gave it a gentle push. For the first time in 9 months, my daughter laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a forced smile, but a real, genuine laugh that came from somewhere deep inside her soul. I quickly pulled out my phone and started recording, tears streaming down my face as I watched her actually enjoying herself again. I was so focused on Sophie that I didn't notice the woman approaching from the neighboring property until she was practically on top of us. "I'm the HOA president here," the woman announced in a tone that could freeze hell over. "Did you get permission before moving in?" The moment she spoke, Sophie's laughter died instantly. "My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm a software engineer who works from home. After my wife Sarah lost her battle with cancer last year, my daughter Sophie and I have been struggling to find our way back to anything resembling normal life. The lake cabin has been in our family for over 30 years. Built by my grandfather in 1991 as a weekend retreat, where 3 generations of our family created memories together. The cabin sits on a beautiful quarter-acre lot with direct lake access, surrounded by mature oak trees and featuring a private dock that my grandfather built by hand. It's a modest, 2-bedroom structure. Nothing fancy, but it represents everything our family values: simplicity, connection to nature, and time spent together away from the chaos of modern life. When Sarah was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, we spent her final months at the cabin, watching sunsets from the porch and talking about all the dreams we'd never get to fulfill together. She made me promise that I'd bring Sophie back here when we were ready to heal, to remember the joy instead of just the grief. Sophie had been struggling since her mother's death. The therapist said she needed something to help her reconnect with happiness, and the cabin was where our family had always been most content. But our old house felt like a museum of grief, filled with reminders of everything we'd lost. That's why I decided to move some of Sophie's belongings to the cabin, hoping that a change of environment might help her process her emotions and rediscover some sense of peace. We'd packed up her art supplies, favorite books, and comfort items, planning to spend the summer there while she attended grief counseling sessions in town. The woman who confronted us looked to be in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expression that screamed, "I'm in charge here." She wore a crisp white polo shirt and khaki pants like she was dressed for a country club board meeting. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone who thrived on conflict and control. The way she said permission made it sound like we were trespassing on royal grounds. I later told my lawyer. Sophie immediately stopped swinging and retreated behind me, all traces of joy vanishing from her face. I tried to keep my voice calm and diplomatic, explaining that we were just moving some of my daughter's belongings into our family cabin. But this woman, who I would soon learn was named Diane Morrison, wasn't interested in explanations. She looked at Sophie with obvious disapproval and made a comment about children today not knowing proper manners. Then she began walking around our property like she owned it, taking photos from every conceivable angle with her phone. She examined our license plate and made notes in a little leather-bound book, all while making comments about maintaining community standards and proper procedures. "I'll be thoroughly researching whether your family has legal rights to be here," she declared, as if our 40-year-old family cabin was some kind of illegal settlement. The whole time, Sophie was getting smaller and smaller, physically shrinking away from this hostile stranger who had destroyed her first moment of happiness in months. I could see the fear in my daughter's eyes, the same look she'd had at the hospital when we realized her mother wasn't coming home. This woman was taking away the one thing that had brought Sophie joy, and I felt my protective instincts kicking into overdrive, but I forced myself to stay calm, telling Diane that she could research all she wanted. But to please not make my daughter uncomfortable, Diane's response chilled me to the bone. She gave me this cold, calculating smile and said, "Oh, we'll see who ends up uncomfortable." There was something in her voice that told me this wasn't just a misunderstanding about property rules. This was personal, and she had already decided that Sophie and I were the enemy. I should have known right then that this wasn't a welcome to the neighborhood. This was a declaration of war. As Diane walked away, still taking photos and muttering about community standards, Sophie came up beside me and whispered, "Dad, I don't like her. She makes me feel scared." I put my arm around my daughter and watched Diane disappear into her house, already planning her next move. I had no idea that in less than 2 hours, she would escalate this from an uncomfortable conversation to full-scale psychological warfare against my grieving child. 2 hours later, I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen when I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple car doors slamming shut. Through the window, I saw 2 police cruisers and what looked like a social services vehicle pulling into our driveway. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. Diane had actually called the authorities on us. Sophie was upstairs organizing her room when she heard the commotion and came running to the window. The moment she saw the police cars, she started hyperventilating. "Daddy, what's happening? Why are there so many cars?" I could hear the panic in her voice, the same terror she'd felt during those awful weeks when we were losing her mother. Officer Martinez, a stern-looking man in his 40s, approached the front door with a social worker close behind. The officer explained that they'd received a report about a strange man with a distressed child, possibly a kidnapping or abuse situation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Diane had actually told them I might be kidnapping my own daughter. The social worker, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes but a serious expression, explained that they needed to interview Sophie and me separately as part of standard protocol. I started recording the conversation on my phone, something I'd learned to do after dealing with insurance companies during Sarah's illness. Sophie was clinging to my arm, begging me not to let them take her away. And it broke my heart to see her so terrified. These were good people just doing their jobs, but they had no idea they were re-traumatizing a child who had already been through hell. While the social worker spoke with Sophie in the living room, Officer Martinez took me aside to verify our identities and relationship. I provided our driver's licenses, Sophie's birth certificate, custody documents, and even medical records from her grief counseling sessions. The officer was professional but thorough, asking questions about why we were at the cabin and whether there had been any previous incidents. Meanwhile, I could hear Sophie crying in the other room, telling the social worker about losing her mom and how scared she was that someone was trying to separate us. The whole scene was surreal, like we were being investigated for the crime of trying to heal from our loss. But what made it even worse was knowing that Diane was probably watching from her window, enjoying the spectacle she had created. That's when Diane made her appearance, walking over to speak directly with the social worker. Instead of backing down when she saw how distressed Sophie was, she actually doubled down on her accusations. I heard her tell the social worker that she was very concerned about the child's mental state, that it wasn't normal for a 16-year-old to cry hysterically like this. Then she suggested that maybe there was abuse happening, asking why else would they show up randomly at a property. I lost my composure for a moment and told Officer Martinez that this woman was accusing me of abusing my own daughter based on nothing more than the fact that we were moving into our family cabin. Diane responded with fake concern, claiming she was just looking out for the community's children, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She was enjoying every minute of this drama. Fortunately, the evidence spoke for itself. Officer Martinez verified all our identification documents, confirmed our property ownership records, and reviewed Sophie's medical history with her grief counselor. The social worker spent nearly an hour with Sophie and concluded there were no signs of abuse or neglect, just a traumatized teenager who was terrified of being separated from her only surviving parent. The officers apologized for the confusion and warned Diane about making false reports to authorities, but the damage was already done. Sophie was completely traumatized by the experience. As the police cars pulled away, my daughter was still shaking and clinging to me, like I might disappear at any moment. She kept asking if Diane was going to call more people, if they were going to try to separate us again. I held her tight and promised that nobody would ever separate us. But inside, I was planning my counterattack. The worst part was seeing the neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Some looked concerned and sympathetic, but others were whispering and pointing, already forming judgments based on the police presence. Sophie noticed them too, and I could see her shrinking further into herself, embarrassed and ashamed of something that wasn't her fault. This woman had taken my daughter's first moment of joy in 9 months and turned it into a public humiliation. She had used the police and social services as weapons against a grieving child, and I knew this was just the beginning. As we went back inside and I helped Sophie calm down, I made a silent promise. Nobody gets to terrorize my child and walk away unscathed. That night, as Sophie finally fell asleep after hours of crying, I sat on the porch and planned my next move. Diane had played her first card, using false police reports and child welfare accusations to try to force us out, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I'm a software engineer who works from home, which means I have time, resources, and a very methodical approach to problem solving. If Diane wanted to play games with my daughter's mental health, she was about to learn that some games have very serious consequences. I started a detailed log of everything that had happened, complete with timestamps, photos, and audio recordings. If this woman wanted a war, I was going to give her one, but I was going to fight smart. The next morning, I woke up to find our mailbox stuffed with official-looking violation notices. Unauthorized occupancy, $1,200. Noise violations during moving hours, $400. Landscaping non-compliance for grass that was apparently 3 inches too long, $600. Improper waste disposal for having normal trash bags outside, $300. The total came to $2,500 in fines for 1 day of completely normal activity. I realized this wasn't coincidence or overzealous rule enforcement. This was coordinated psychological warfare designed to make us feel unwelcome and financially pressured to leave. Each violation notice was printed on official-looking letterhead and referenced specific HOA codes and regulations. But something felt off about the whole thing. The language was oddly formal, and some of the violation codes seemed made up. While I was studying the violation notices, Sophie came downstairs looking exhausted and anxious. She'd barely slept after yesterday's police incident, and now she was worried about these new threats. I tried to reassure her that everything would be fine, but I could see the fear in her eyes growing stronger. That's when she told me she'd been unable to sleep and had spent hours researching our situation online. "Dad, something's really wrong here," she said, showing me her laptop screen. Our cabin address isn't listed on any official HOA website or property database. She'd found community discussion forums where people talked about various properties in the area. But our cabin was mysteriously absent from all official HOA documentation. This was the first sign that Diane's authority might not be as legitimate as she claimed. The psychological warfare escalated when neighbors started avoiding us. Someone had posted in a private community group about a concerning new resident situation, describing it as a possible transient living arrangement with an unstable minor child. The post included distant, blurry photos of Sophie looking upset after the police incident, along with speculation about our mental state and suggestions that the community needed to protect its children and property values. Sophie found screenshots that concerned neighbors had shared with her. The comments were brutal, with people speculating about everything from drug problems to domestic violence, all based on Diane's carefully crafted narrative. My daughter was mortified that strangers were discussing her mental health and making judgments about our family based on lies and manipulated photos. This was when I decided to do some investigative work of my own. I tried calling the official HOA office number listed on the violation notices, but it was permanently disconnected. The emails I sent to the HOA board bounced back as undeliverable. I started researching Diane online and discovered she was going through a messy divorce with custody battles over her younger child. Court documents mentioned her need to demonstrate leadership abilities and community involvement to impress her custody lawyer. The pattern became clear. She needed victories and success stories to prove her worth as a community leader. And we had become her target for demonstrating how effectively she could handle problem residents. But the more I dug, the more suspicious I became about the legitimacy of her entire operation. Meanwhile, Sophie couldn't sleep and was spending late nights researching property records and HOA incorporation dates. She discovered that many of the community discussions online mentioned properties that weren't actually listed in official HOA documentation. Our cabin kept coming up as an anomaly, a property that seemed to exist in a legal gray area that nobody understood. Dad, I think there's something fundamentally wrong with this whole HOA situation, she told me one evening. She'd found discrepancies between Diane's claims about community rules and the actual public records of what areas were legally under HOA jurisdiction. The breakthrough came when Sophie found an old document folder that had been left in a spare room by previous family members. Inside was what appeared to be an HOA membership agreement with my grandfather's signature, dated 1994, showing our cabin voluntarily joining the HOA. My heart sank when I saw it, thinking that maybe my grandfather really had signed us up for this nightmare. But Sophie wasn't satisfied with the surface evidence. Wait, Dad, let me examine this more carefully, she said. Getting out a magnifying glass she'd ordered online for her research project. She spent an hour comparing the signature on the HOA document with birthday cards and letters that my grandfather had written to our family over the years. The handwriting analysis revealed something shocking. The signature on the HOA document was completely fake. But Sophie's detective work didn't stop there. She started cross-referencing the dates on the fake document with public records about when our cabin was built and when the HOA was actually incorporated. What she discovered changed everything. Dad, our house was built in 1991. But this HOA wasn't even established until 1995. According to state records, houses that existed before an HOA was created are automatically exempt from HOA control, unless the owners voluntarily choose to join. We were never legally subject to Diane's authority in the first place. All those violation notices, all those threats about fines and penalties, all the harassment and intimidation, it was all based on a completely fraudulent claim of jurisdiction over our property. Sophie looked up from her laptop with wide eyes and said the words that changed our entire situation. Dad, this signature is fake, and our house was built before the HOA even existed. That's when everything clicked into place. We weren't just fighting an overzealous HOA president who was abusing her power. We were fighting someone who was running a complete fraud operation, using fake documents and non-existent authority to harass and extort money from families like ours. Diane had created an elaborate scam, and we had stumbled into the middle of it just by trying to heal from our loss at our family cabin. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. Every violation notice, every threat, every moment of fear and anxiety that Sophie had experienced was all based on lies. Diane had no legal authority over our property, no right to issue fines or violations, and no legitimate basis for any of her demands. She was essentially a neighborhood bully who had created fake letterhead and official-looking documents to intimidate people into compliance. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had targeted a software engineer with time, resources, and a very angry protective instinct when it came to his daughter's well-being. Sophie and I spent the entire next day in the attic, searching through decades of family documents and property records. We found the original building permit from 1991 with official county stamps and signatures, proving beyond doubt that our cabin predated the HOA by 4 years. We located the HOA incorporation papers showing they were established in 1995, and we researched state law to confirm that pre-existing homes are automatically exempt from HOA control, unless owners voluntarily choose to join. Your grandfather was way smarter than we thought, I told Sophie as we organized the evidence. It was becoming clear that other pre-existing homes in the area were also being illegally targeted by Diane's operation, and we had stumbled onto what appeared to be a systematic fraud scheme that had been running for years. The smoking gun came when Sophie found a sealed manila envelope hidden behind some old photo albums. Inside was an official county exemption letter from 1996, a formal document confirming permanent exemption status for all pre-existing properties in our area. The legal language was crystal clear. Any attempt to impose HOA authority on exempt properties constitutes harassment under state anti-harassment statutes, with specific penalties of $10,000 per individual violation incident. The document was signed by the county clerk, officially filed and recorded, creating legally bulletproof protection that Diane had been violating repeatedly. This wasn't just a matter of her overstepping her authority. She was actively breaking state law with every fake violation notice she had sent us. But the most emotional discovery came when Sophie found a handwritten note from my grandfather tucked inside the exemption envelope for my future granddaughter. The note read, "May this house always be your sanctuary, free from those who would try to control your joy." Both Sophie and I broke down crying as we read those words, feeling my grandfather's protection reaching across time to shield us from exactly the kind of person he had anticipated we might face. He was protecting us before I was even born. Sophie whispered through her tears. I realized that my father had been wise enough to secure legal protections for future generations of our family. He had foreseen that someday someone like Diane might try to control and manipulate us, and he had made sure we would have the legal tools to fight back. Now came the satisfying part, calculating exactly how much legal trouble Diane had created for herself. I carefully documented every violation notice she had sent, every harassment incident, every false claim of authority she had made. Over the past 3 days, she had committed 12 separate acts of harassment under state anti-harassment law, each carrying a $10,000 fine. The total potential penalty was $120,000 in personal fines, and because these were individual acts of harassment rather than organizational violations, the HOA corporation could not protect her from personal liability. Diane had unknowingly created massive legal exposure for herself while trying to intimidate a grieving family. Instead of confronting Diane directly with our evidence, I decided to take a more strategic approach that would educate the community and expose her fraud operation publicly. I organized a historical lakeside community tour, sending friendly invitations to all our neighbors to come learn about the fascinating pre-HOA history of our area. The invitation emphasized the educational nature of the event, describing it as an opportunity to discover the rich heritage of our beautiful lakeside community and understand the legal protections that some older properties enjoyed. I set up displays with historical photos of the area, original property documents, timeline charts showing when different homes were built, and copies of the state laws governing HOA jurisdiction. It was a brilliant strategy because it would give me a chance to control the narrative and share factual information with the community before Diane could spin more lies about our situation. About 15 neighbors showed up for the historical tour, genuinely curious about the local history and legal complexities they had never understood. I explained the concept of pre-existing property protections and legal rights that older homeowners enjoyed, showing the clear timeline of our cabin being built in 1991, while the HOA was established in 1995. I displayed the official exemption documents and explained the relevant state laws in simple terms that everyone could understand. Several neighbors suddenly realized that their own older houses might be protected under the same laws, and they started asking questions about their own property rights. Diane's false narrative about universal HOA authority was beginning to crumble publicly as people learned the actual facts about property law and community governance. The community education session was going perfectly until Diane showed up uninvited and tried to disrupt the entire gathering. She marched into the middle of our peaceful educational event and started shouting about this being an illegal gathering without proper HOA approval. "This man is trying to undermine our community's legal structure," she declared dramatically, clearly trying to turn the neighbors against me through intimidation and bluster. But her aggressive tactics backfired spectacularly because I stayed calm and responded with facts rather than emotion. "Actually, let's discuss what's really legal here," I said, and then I showed the exemption documents to the entire group of neighbors who were watching this confrontation unfold. Diane realized she was losing control of the narrative completely as people started asking her pointed questions about her authority and the legitimacy of her claims. The public confrontation revealed Diane's true character to everyone who was watching. Instead of engaging with the factual evidence I was presenting, she resorted to threats and intimidation, claiming she would call another emergency HOA meeting and pursue full legal action against our family. But the neighbors could see through her bluster now that they understood the actual legal situation. Several people started whispering among themselves, questioning what else Diane might have lied about and wondering how many other families had been illegally harassed under her fake authority. The community was beginning to wake up to the reality that they had been living under the rule of someone who had no legitimate power over them. The most powerful moment of the community education session came when Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow whose husband had built their house in 1989, started crying as she realized she had been illegally charged HOA fees for over a decade. She had been living on a fixed income and struggling to pay assessments that she never legally owed. While Diane had been pocketing money from multiple families under false pretenses, several other neighbors shared similar stories of financial hardship caused by Diane's illegal fee collections. And the community began to understand that this wasn't just about our family's harassment, but about systematic financial fraud that had been affecting their neighbors for years. After Diane stormed off, shouting threats about emergency meetings and permanent bans, several neighbors stayed behind to ask more questions about their own property rights. An elderly couple mentioned that their house was built in 1988, and they wanted to know if they might have the same protections we enjoyed. A single mother with 2 young children asked if she had been illegally charged HOA fees for years. Since her townhouse was also built before the HOA existed, it became clear that Diane's fraud operation had been systematically targeting multiple families, and our situation was just the tip of the iceberg. The community was starting to realize they had been victims of organized deception, and they weren't happy about it. The next day, we received Diane's response to our community education session, an official ultimatum calling for an emergency HOA meeting within 48 hours. The meeting notice claimed there would be a final vote to permanently ban our family from the community, with threats of full legal action, including acid Zeicher, if we didn't comply. The language was even more aggressive and desperate than her previous communications, and I could tell she was panicking about losing her grip on power. She was making increasingly extreme threats because she knew her authority was being exposed as fraudulent, and she was hoping to intimidate us into leaving before the truth came out completely. But I wasn't intimidated by her threats anymore. I was excited about the opportunity to expose her fraud operation in front of the entire community. I sent back a polite RSVP confirming that I wouldn't miss the meeting for the world, and that it was time for everyone to learn what real authority actually looked like. Sophie asked if I was scared about the confrontation, and I told her honestly that I wasn't worried at all. When you know you're holding nuclear codes, you don't fear someone who's throwing paper airplanes. Diane had no idea she was walking into her own execution, and I was looking forward to watching her realize that she had built her entire operation on lies that were about to be exposed publicly. The community center was packed beyond capacity on the night of Diane's emergency meeting, with people standing along the walls and crowding in the doorway to witness what everyone knew would be a dramatic confrontation. Diane had positioned herself at the front of the room with her remaining supporters, clearly confident that she could rally the community to permanently ban our family and end this challenge to her authority once and for all. Sophie and I sat calmly in the front row with our organized documents and evidence files, ready to present our case when the time was right. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and you could feel the nervous energy of a community that was about to witness either a public execution or a complete revolution. Diane launched into her grand performance, with all the drama and passion of a courtroom prosecutor making a closing argument in a murder trial. She spent 15 minutes delivering an elaborate presentation about protecting community values and maintaining the rule of law, emphasizing how important it was for everyone to follow established procedures and respect legitimate authority. This man believes that rules simply don't apply to him, she declared with righteous indignation, gesturing dramatically in my direction. Today, we prove that in our community, everyone follows our laws and respects our democratic processes. She appealed to people's fears about declining property values, safety concerns, and the potential chaos that might result if residents were allowed to ignore HOA regulations. If we allow this precedent to stand, what's next? Anyone can simply decide to ignore our rules and do whatever they want on their property. Her presentation included enlarged photos of our cabin, claims about various code violations and safety issues, and dire warnings about the precedent that would be set if the community failed to take decisive action against our family. Several residents actually applauded her speech, and the momentum seemed to be building in her favor. She had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this moment, crafting her arguments to appeal to people's desire for order and their fear of change. The vote appeared likely to pass, and Diane looked smugly confident as she prepared to call for all residents in favor of permanently banning our family from the community. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had given her entire presentation before allowing me to respond, which meant the community hadn't heard the other side of the story yet. This was the moment I had been waiting for, and I stood up slowly, with the calm confidence of someone who knows they're holding a royal flush while their opponent is bluffing with a pair of twos. Before you vote, I said in a clear, steady voice that carried throughout the packed room, I have something very important to share with everyone. Diane is absolutely right that everyone in this community should follow the law. So let me show you what the actual law says about our situation. I connected my laptop to the large screen at the front of the room and began projecting a carefully prepared presentation that would destroy Diane's entire operation with documented facts and legal evidence. The room fell completely silent as people realized they were about to learn something that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew about their community. The first slide showed a simple timeline with official documentation: cabin construction, $1,991, with the original building permit clearly displayed on screen. HOA Incorporation, $1,995, with the state filing documents proving the establishment date. Simple math. Everyone. We were here first. The second slide explained Virginia state law regarding pre-existing homes and HOA jurisdiction, with the relevant legal code displayed in plain English that anyone could understand. Pre-existing homes are automatically exempt from HOA control and cannot be forced to join without voluntary written agreement. This is state law, not something that's open to negotiation or interpretation. The third slide showed our official county exemption letter from 1996, the formal document confirming permanent protection from any HOA authority. This is legally bulletproof protection that was filed with the county clerk and recorded in public records. But the fourth slide was where things got really interesting for Diane's personal situation. I displayed a comprehensive list of all 12 violation notices she had sent us, each one representing a separate incident of harassment under state anti-harassment statutes. The penalty for each violation is $10,000 in personal fines. And since these are individual acts of harassment rather than organizational violations, the HOA Corporation cannot provide legal protection for individual members who break the law. The total potential penalty is $120,000 in personal liability, all of which falls directly on Diane as an individual who exceeded her legal authority and engaged in systematic harassment of a family with a minor child. The room went completely silent as the implications of what I was presenting began to sink in. Diane turned white as a sheet and stammered, "That can't be legal." But I calmly explained that not only was it legal, it was all filed with the state and county authorities as a matter of public record. And here's the best part. I continued, pulling out a thick folder of legal documents. I'm not suing the HOA as an organization, because this isn't about organizational policy or community governance. I'm suing you personally, Diane, for harassment, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress on a minor child, filing false police reports, and abuse of emergency services. Every violation notice you sent, every social media post you made, every false claim of authority you asserted, it's all documented evidence in a personal lawsuit against you as an individual. The community reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several residents immediately started apologizing to Sophie and me, clearly embarrassed that they had been manipulated into supporting harassment against a grieving family. Others began demanding Diane's immediate resignation, angry that they had been deceived about the legal situation and used as pawns in her personal power game. A few of Diane's remaining supporters quietly slipped out the back door, not wanting to be associated with someone who was facing such serious legal consequences. Diane was completely speechless, her lawyer whispering frantically in her ear about the need to settle immediately and avoid the catastrophic financial consequences of fighting this case in court. The meeting ended with Diane being unanimously removed from her position by an emergency vote of the remaining board members, who were desperate to distance the organization from her illegal activities. Several residents came up to apologize personally and ask how they could help other families who might have been affected by similar harassment. Sophie was surrounded by neighbor kids who wanted to befriend her and make up for the way she had been treated. The entire community dynamic had shifted in a single evening, from supporting an authoritarian leader to embracing transparency and legal accountability. Diane sat alone at the front of the table, facing the reality that her reign of intimidation was over and her personal financial ruin was just beginning. The aftermath of that community meeting was swift and decisive. Within 24 hours, Diane's lawyer had dropped her case and advised her to settle immediately rather than face the catastrophic financial consequences of fighting our lawsuit in court. The emergency HOA board meeting that same night resulted in a unanimous 6-0 vote, removing her as president. With the new interim leadership publicly apologizing to our family, and announcing an immediate policy review of all pre-existing home statuses in the community. Several other affected families came forward with similar harassment stories, and it became clear that Diane had been running a systematic fraud operation that had illegally targeted multiple households for years. The community finally understood the scope of her deception and rallied together to support the families who had been victimized by her fake authority. The legal resolution came quickly once Diane realized the overwhelming evidence against her and the impossibility of defending her position in court. She agreed to pay full damages for our emotional distress and legal fees, plus an additional penalty for the harassment of a minor child. The restraining order prohibited any future contact with our family, and she was required to post a public apology in the community newsletter, acknowledging her illegal behavior and abuse of authority. Most satisfying of all, she agreed to move out of the community within 60 days, effectively banishing herself from the neighborhood she had tried to control through intimidation and fraud. All of her fake violation notices were officially voided and removed from any community records, clearing our family's name completely. The community healing process was remarkable to witness, as neighbors who had believed Diane's lies came to apologize personally and ask how they could help repair the damage that had been done. An elderly neighbor discovered that his house had been built in 1988 and realized he had been illegally paying HOA fees for over a decade. A single mother learned that her townhouse was also protected under the same pre-existing property laws, saving her thousands of dollars in future fees and assessments. The new HOA leadership implemented transparency and accountability measures to prevent future abuse of power, and property values actually increased as the community became more unified and trustworthy. The personal transformation in Sophie was the most important outcome of this entire ordeal. She had gone from being a victim of harassment to being the detective who exposed a fraud operation, using her intelligence and research skills to protect our family and help other victims. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt confident and empowered, understanding that she didn't have to be helpless in the face of bullies. The experience taught her that preparation, evidence, and courage could overcome intimidation and lies. She installed a beautiful, upgraded swing set at the cabin, turning it into a symbol of joy and resilience, rather than grief and loss. We hung a wooden sign by the front door that read, "Lakeside Cabin. Established 1991. Protected by Grandpa. Since 1996. HOA free. And Karen proof forever." Diane moved out 2 weeks later. I heard she's selling insurance now in another state, probably targeting elderly customers who don't know their rights. Funny how life works out. Sophie and I spent that entire summer at the cabin, healing from our loss and building new memories. While honoring the old ones, she made genuine friendships with several neighbor kids and rediscovered her love of reading and art. Most importantly, she learned that when someone tries to take away your safe space, you don't have to accept it quietly. Sometimes the best way to honor the people you've lost is to fight for the places where their memory lives on. The lake cabin remains our sanctuary, legally protected by my grandfather's foresight and defended by a teenager's determination to uncover the truth. And every time Sophie swings on that old oak tree, laughing in the golden light of sunset, I know that Sarah and my father are both watching over us, proud that we refused to let a bully steal our joy